Hey, Mean Matt here. So I just finished watching last night the Scott Hall story on ESPN. Actually, I saw it on YouTube, and you know, it kind of made me, and it really was an interesting documentary. Um, a friend of mine and myself were actually talking about it the other day about Scott Hall because I saw a video where they showed the match with him and Just Incredible and how bad looking Scott Hall was. And I thought, well, that's just, people think that Jake Roberts was bad. But see, here's the thing. I don't feel bad for Scott Hall. And that might sound a bit rude. That might sound a bit, terrible of me to say. But I don't feel bad for Scott Hall because you go 10 times to rehab. Do you not think maybe you should stop doing what you're doing? Say what you want about Say what you want about Jake Roberts, you know. I mean, shit. Even Dave Mustaine from Megadeth went to rehab probably 12 times now, and he's been sober for a fucking decade. But, but here's it's fascinating because no one would ever have thought out of all the wrestlers, no one ever thought that it was going to be Scott Hall. No one ever thought about that. And they showed the footage of when, he came down the aisle and looked just like, he acted just like a 90-year-old man. You know, he was so messed up. It just really had to have been the most, and just incredible even said that was the most embarrassing match I've ever been involved with. But if you watch the documentary, they had Sean X-Pac Waltman on there, and he was saying that the guy who ran the show wanted Scott Hall to be there, and the fans expected it, but X-Pac was like, well, you know, that's bullshit. The guy should not have been there. He was in no frame of mind. And when you start having seizures, you know, that's the saddest part of it all, is that you can't erase that. But what got me was, Scott had a family where his mom was an alcoholic, his dad was an alcoholic, both his grandparents were alcoholics. You would think, well, you understand why he became the way he did. But on the other hand, if you see guys like Shawn Michaels or Kevin Nash or Sean Waltman decide to stop doing drugs, do you think maybe it's high time that you start? Because when I saw WWE way back in the early 90s and had Razor Ramon come out, and he was a really good character, and then he left, and I think that's when everything kind of went all to hell because of that. In certain ways, I don't know, but that's kind of how things transpired, I guess. So it's very difficult to see something see someone go through that, but at the same time, you have to realize that it does happen. You know, I'm not too sure about how Jake Roberts is doing with his daughters, but we just found out that Scott Hall and his kid, his one son, are estranged now because he just cannot stop doing drugs. And it kind of pisses me off because here you have one of the top greatest wrestlers of the 90s, and you have Scott Hall in there. And you have to realize that, okay, so I understand the history now, and Scott Hall shot a guy in 83, or whenever, 83 or 84, and it doesn't get mentioned unless Bischoff or McMahon knew about this. So you have a guy like Scott Hall, who's one of the top greatest wrestlers, but you can't have Chris Benoit. I mean, yes, Chris Benoit murdered his wife and son and then killed himself. But he was not in the right frame of mind. And yet you choose to shun him. But here you have Scott Hall, who was, and still is, quite frankly, a mess. You know, it just doesn't really make sense. But that's only my opinion, you know. That's just how it is. I mean, it was one of those documentaries where you would think, okay, you know, you can't blame the wrestling world because it's not their fault that he's like that. It's Scott Hall's fault. You know, a lot of people will say, well, yeah, it was wrestling, but it wasn't wrestling. It was Scott Hall who chose to do drugs, who chose to gain 300 pounds, who chose to show up at an arena fucked up. So it's just, it's you know, something that people need to think about is that it's not wrestling that makes people who they are. Sure, maybe steroids, but even that, it's like, you have to separate that from reality sometimes. You know, I'm a lifelong wrestling fan, and I still choose to be, even though there's guys dropping before the age of 60. You know, I've noticed that anyways, but it happens, you know, it does happen, and it sucks, but, you know, yeah, if you haven't seen the documentary, you should watch it. Yeah, it's quite an interesting one. And scary at the same time. If you look, you know, you look at his face and he's just not there at the arena. It's quite disturbing, actually. So, that'll be it for me. Okay. See you later.